I'm Dr. Erica Bove, and welcome to the Love and Science podcast. I'm your host, and also the founder of Love and Science, Thriving Through Infertility. I'm so excited you're here today. With over a decade of experience helping thousands of women just like you, I empower professional women to build their families with confidence and compassion. Let's dive in. Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Love and Science podcast. I could not be more thrilled to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Stombaugh, with me. She is an amazing human, and I just want to say before I formally introduce her, she's actually the reason we have a podcast called Love and Science. It's so true. I wanted to bring this up because back in the day when I was had this dream of a podcast, but I had all this mind drama about technology, she was like, don't worry, I figured it out in a way that doesn't involve lots of staff, and let me sit with you and explain all the things. And so we sat down, virtually for 45 minutes. We recorded the session. She showed me this thing called GarageBand and Buzzsprout and how she started her podcast, because she was a little ahead of me in her timing. And it got me over my drama. And I was able to start and publish this starting 2 Marches ago. And so I just wanted to honor that, Sarah, because
Oh my gosh.
I really truly you're the reason
Mhm.
that I was able to overcome all the things to be able to be here in general. And so the fact that you're a guest on the podcast today just feels like very full circle. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that. Thank you for sharing that with me and with your audience. And, it's so funny being physicians as we are, sometimes tackling new things and learning new things can create a lot of mind drama. And so,
yeah.
yeah, I'm so glad I could come on that journey with you and be here
Yeah.
today.
So here we are. So let me formally introduce you. So Dr. Sarah Stombaugh, she is an amazing human, first and foremost. She's a family medicine physician by training and a diplomat of the American Board of Obesity Medicine. She is a graduate from Creighton University Medical School, and she completed her family medicine residency at the University of Chicago. She practiced outpatient primary care in Evanston, Illinois, before moving to Charlottesville, Virginia, to take on this new venture that she does. So basically, what she does now is she has a private practice weight loss clinic where she sees patients both in person and I believe virtually. Is that right?
Yes.
In Charlottesville. And she offers telemedicine for people who are struggling with weight. And it's beautiful. She's the author of the Conquer Your Weight podcast, which is, I've been a guest there. So we'll put the link to that interview in the show notes as well. And through her work, she's able to share valuable insights, expert opinions, and practical advice on weight management, which helps contribute to the health of us all, truly. I think being a coach and a doctor, somebody family medicine who sees the whole picture, and also someone who has tremendous expertise in medical weight loss, can speak on surgical weight loss, and also the multidisciplinary care it can take to really have the best possible outcomes. I'm just so very excited to have her with us today. Thank you, Dr. Stombaugh. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I'm excited to share today with your audience because I just have such a special place in my heart for people who are struggling with fertility, going through the IVS journey. And it's often a patient population that many physicians are unwilling to support. And so it is a group of patients I love supporting. And so I'm excited for us to talk about that.
Yeah. And I will say all my patients are so motivated, and it's just tell me what to do and I'll do it. But I will say, even as an REI and a special interest in, weight optimization and all those things, there are many times that I feel oh gosh, this is beyond the boundaries of what I feel comfortable with. I don't know how to answer this question. And I'm so glad to
Mhm.
have you here because I think we all need to work together to share the information to really bring about the best possible outcomes. So with that, I wanted to start with a request I actually got this weekend. This is true. As of the date of this recording, this came through maybe 3-4 days ago. And I was like, oh shoot, I don't know what to do. I gotta phone a friend, look at the data. So this is somebody who, it may very well be very similar to you if you're listening to this podcast. She's a 40-year-old physician. She lives in the US. She's on an IVF journey, single parenthood by choice. And so basically, she was on Wegovy, right? And she got her BMI down from 41 to 34. And basically, she was on the medication. Her own PCP was concerned because, quote unquote, this is the next opioid epidemic. So I'm going to, sort of
Oh,
limit your dose and space it out. Then she regained 25 pounds she had lost over the course of being on it and really struggled to, sort of get back on it. Right. And really wanted to, but I think there was some resistance as we see. Um, then she contacted her REI and was able to do IVF and was able to get, sort of 3 euploid embryos, which is fantastic. Often the rate limiting step in IVF is embryo generation. But basically, then she started the Wegovy and it's like, okay, well, shoot, like now that I have these embryos, I'm trying to lose weight in the effort to get back in a better place where I can start to transfer these embryos, but what is actually the recommendations, like what are the recommendations leading up to the embryo transfer, even during pregnancy, like what data do we have, quote unquote, the GLPs have really been life changing, mostly because it made me feel like a normal person and I wasn't constantly thinking obsessing about food all the time, allowing me to more easily focus on my actual tasks and goals on life, which by the way is being a physician, sort of serving the people. But, sort of let's sort of unpack this a little bit. Like, how would you approach somebody like this? How would you guide them? Understanding that in this context, it's not officially medical advice, but it's
mhm.
us using our expertise to educate. What do you think? How can we sort of advise this beautiful soul?
Yes. So I love this case study because this is such a common type of question that I get all of the time. And especially for patients who will be pursuing pregnancy in any context, there's this, we know that these medications at this time are not recommended during pregnancy. So we know that we're talking about typically a short term use of this medication, which then can have effects like weight rebound, for example. And so there's really, really a lot to unpack here. Realistically, we could probably use this case study to talk about some, each of the different things as we're thinking about it. So when we look at the data of the GLP medications, the reality is there is a few different medications that we're talking about. And then as we think about those, thinking about what is our timeline for pregnancy, what are the factors to consider? So thinking about the different medications. So breaking it down into medications that are semaglutide products. So those are Ozempic and Wegovy, which this patient, of course, or this client is talking about. Then medications that are tirzepatide products. So that's Zepbound and Manjaro. And then even other medications like liraglutide, oh my goodness, liraglutide, for example, which is Saxenda or Victoza, and actually can have a really beautiful place to use alongside the IVF journey as well. So when we look at these medications, a lot of times understanding someone's IVF timeline is really important. So we want to understand, are we talking about the egg retrieval component? And there'll be considerations about pausing before egg retrieval and the anesthesia implications of that. And then are they going immediately into the IVF journey versus are they going to be taking a pause and looking at pursuing IVF at some point in the future? So we'll come back to some of the anesthesia piece and the IVF or the egg retrieval piece, but trying to understand what is someone's timeline for pregnancy, for implantation, and then we can start to work backwards from there. How long would we need someone to be off of these medications specifically? Now, this data is relevant as of 2025. As we get more and more information, we may be able to adjust these guidelines, and you and I may need to have a future conversation in a couple of years. But what we're looking at right now is talking about having medications out of the system in advance of pregnancy. So the nice thing about IVF is that we have often very clear timelines about what that looks like. Now, a little bit of fluctuation here or there as you're looking at, where are the peak points in the cycle and how are you responding to some of the medications. But for someone like this who's already had egg retrieval, we're just, we have a pretty tight timeline as to what that will look like. So, as we're thinking about the semaglutide products, Wegovy and Ozempic, the official recommendation is those should be out of the system for 8 weeks before trying to conceive. Now, I will say I like to look at the half life data as well, because when we look at the half life of these medications for the semaglutide products, Ozempic, Wegovy, we're talking about a 7-day half life. So, realistically, when you look at pharmacokinetics, you look at how are medications being processed through the system, how long does it take for that to be eliminated? The reality is, after 4 to 5 half lives, a medication is going to be mostly out of your system, and by six half life, nearly undetectable. And so, for an Ozempic or Wegovy medication, a 7-day half-life, we're really talking about 42 days or 6 weeks that these medications would take to be out of the system. So that recommendation of 8 weeks is going to give us a pretty solid buffer. I very frequently see people recommending even longer periods of time, and those are based on sometimes fear-based medicine, for example, or physicians who are trying to protect their patients, I think at their core, but sometimes inadvertently end up causing harm in this way where patients have been discontinued for really long periods of time unnecessarily. So looking at certainly that 8 weeks, but realistically, maybe even cutting it a little bit closer than that. Now, interestingly, when we look at the tirzepatide products, so that's Zepbound and Mounjaro, these medications, there actually is not an official recommendation to be out of the system. So when you look at the FDA label for these medications, they say these medications should not be used during pregnancy. They should be discontinued upon a pregnancy being recognized. And there are also recommendations about using contraception in order to prevent pregnancy and using backup methods because we know that oral birth control can be affected by any of these GLP medications. So, interestingly, there's no recommendation. So, most people will utilize the Ozempic and Wegovy recommendations, that 8 weeks, and utilize that for Zepbound and Mounjaro. Now, what we do know is that those medications, Zepbound and Mounjaro, the tirzepatide products have a 5-day half-life. So realistically, even if we look at 6 half-lives of that, we're talking about 30 days of that medication to get out of the system. So being off of the medication solidly for a month, you're looking at that medication being out of the system. Now, one medication that I think is going to maybe regain some popularity is the liraglutide products, so Saxenda and Victoza. Interestingly, Victoza is the version for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Saxenda is labeled for the treatment of obesity. And this medication was FDA approved 11 years ago. It's been around actually for a
Oh,
while. And isn't that wild? No one
yeah.
was talking about it
No, nobody
because
was talking about it, no.
at that time, we had Contrave, which is bupropion naltrexone. We had Qsymia, which is phentermine topiramate. And when you compare Saxenda across those, it's not that much more effective. And nobody
Yeah.
was talking about the GLP receptors at that time, or the receptor agonist at that time. So we had this medication that's a daily injection. So all the other ones we're talking about are weekly injections. So Saxenda, the liraglutide products, are daily injections. And people were like, I don't want to take injection. Can I just take a pill version of something? And now, as we've seen the popularity of all of these other GLPs, there has been a little bit of a resurgence in the Saxenda and the liraglutide community. And I
Right.
bring that up because one, Victoza, the diabetes version of this medication, went generic last summer. So there are generic options of this medication available. And then, most importantly, especially when we're talking about the IVF journey, we're looking at a daily medication, and so, from a half life standpoint, this medication is going to be out of your system completely within a week. And so, that gives us a little bit of flexibility of we can sometimes cut it really close. That if we know the timeline, we could bring someone, even if they were on a Wegovy product, for example, we could switch them over to Saxenda and bring them closer to the pregnancy. So, that can at least prevent some of that weight rebound that can happen in that period of time.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think what this person in who wrote in is really talking about is the bridge. Like, how can I had so much success with the GLPs, but everybody's afraid of them and I'm trying to get pregnant. I have these embryos. Like, how can I bridge to my transfer in a way that I want to feel like a normal human? Like, that's exactly
Mhm.
it. So that could be a possibility in terms of sort of getting closer. When does would somebody have to come off the Saxenda in order to like
About a
how
week.
close? A week? Okay. So
Mhm.
I mean that's really interesting. And I think, one thing I'd love to do is just normalize having an obesity specialist like you as part of the care team from the beginning because it is too much for PCPs to take care, it's too much for
Mhm.
OBGYNs and even REIs. Like we try to educate ourselves as much as possible, but there's so many nuances, like you said. So just normalizing this. And I think another question I have pertinent to her question as well is like, what goals do we really look at? Like, what is the goal? In terms of
Mhm.
like, and I know this is a very individualized conversation, but I think it's important. I see a new patient in my office and say the body mass index, which I know is not perfect, but it's one thing that we use to help guide our management is like say 50 or 55. And so it's like, okay, well, certainly for IVF, we have certain cutoffs, but like what can I tell her? Like when do we just decide that enough is enough and we move forward? You know what I mean? Like that's something
Mhm.
that I struggle with in my practice is that when do we decide to proceed? So let's talk about that a little bit in terms of like how do you approach that conversation? And I mean, I think that some of it is resumption of menses because a lot of the people in this situation are anovulatory, but I will tell you a lot of my patients and clients who come to see me have already tried a lot of things and they're
Mhm.
really trying to get to set the stage for IVF, truly.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think of recognizing that this is going to take some time, right? A lot of times we know, even if we have an idea of what a weight loss goal may be for a person, whether we're talking about medical weight loss or whether we're talking about surgical weight loss, there is going to be some timeline there. And so I think a lot of times that is a huge factor in deciding from a age standpoint, from a fertility standpoint, what are the factors? And this is a great conversation to have with one's REI of how quickly do I need to be pursuing this? Do I have 6 months? Do I have 12 months? Do I have longer? So, something, for example, like bariatric surgery, when we look at bariatric surgery, the data on success in weight loss, the ability to keep it off, and so there's not that same risk of rebound. I mean, certainly we see pregnancy weight gain, but there's not the effect of, oh, I've been on a weight loss medication. I've had to stop that medication for pregnancy and seeing that rebound, which can be really challenging, both physically and then emotionally to deal with.
Of
So
course.
sometimes bariatric surgery can be a really good option to consider if someone has that timeline. When we look at bariatric surgery, realistically, we're talking about then about a 2-year timeline from when that person, and probably even realistically a little bit longer. That's like if everything lines up perfectly, of from when you get in to have a consultation with a bariatric surgeon to a period of medically supervised weight loss. So most insurance companies will require a person has a period of medically supervised weight loss. Most commonly, that's 6 months. There are some variations, and that depends on one's insurance company, but there's typically about a 6-month period of medically supervised weight loss. Other things that are happening in that period as well, meeting with a psychologist, meeting with dietitians. There's monthly visits during that period of time. And then from actually having surgery to where's your body at a place stable from a weight standpoint, but then also from a nutritional standpoint. There's so much in pregnancy, we really, in growing another human, it requires a lot of nutrition in our body to do that. And there is certainly a risk of malnutrition during the weight loss journey, or particularly bariatric surgery journey. So, making sure that patients have really stabilized both from a weight standpoint as well as then from a micronutrient standpoint, that they're getting all their vitamins, their minerals, for example. So,
That's really interesting.
mhm.
Pause, elephant, people edit
Yes.
this out. I did you hear lawn in the background? Did you hear like a lawn? You did not
Mm-mm.
hear that at all? Okay. I just want to make sure that's not a part of our conversation at all. And so we are going to keep the mindset of talking about GLP-1s and micronutrients and how to bridge with nutrition. I just want to, because my headphones were not waiting for me, and I'm like, did my children take them? What happened? I want to do them to really optimize our sound. And I think it's going to be
Mhm.
okay because my Zoom settings are super intense. Because
Mhm.
that I will be right. I just want to find them so that I
Yeah.
can then give us the best possible sound. Let's see. Right. Just a second. We're gonna pause the recording. Dr. Sarah, that's such an interesting point that you just brought up about sort of optimizing the micronutrients. And I'm so curious about this. So when you see a person, how do you know that they're optimized, not just from a weight perspective, but also from a nutritional standpoint? Do you check labs? Like, how do you look at that whole picture?
It can be really challenging. So, a lot of times in our society, we're looking at nutritional deficiencies. So, sometimes if a person is having symptoms that are consistent with nutritional deficiencies, and this can look like skin changes or neurological changes, we will often go seek, a specific, we're looking at B levels, or we're looking at vitamin C, or we're looking at zinc, or we're looking at these very specific nutritional deficiencies that can emerge. But we know that in general, in the weight loss journey, that there may be a risk of those in a maybe just less food is being consumed, whether we're talking about medical weight loss or surgical weight loss. And then in the surgical weight loss as well, there is a malabsorption that can happen. And so for patients who are undergoing weight loss, Typically, I will recommend at the minimum that they're on a multivitamin. So, for most women who are in the pre IVF journey, they may already be on prenatal vitamins. Interestingly, I actually recommend prenatal vitamins for all of my patients, even my men who sometimes look at me like I have 10 heads. But they're just really nice they have good iron, they have good B vitamins. And the proportion of those is a little bit higher in a prenatal and can
Interesting.
really align nicely with what someone needs in a medical weight loss journey. There are also bariatric surgery vitamins, and those generally will be a little bit higher also in fat soluble vitamins. So, particularly patients who've had bariatric surgery are at a risk of vitamin deficiency in fat soluble vitamins, as well as iron as well. So, they may need additional supplementation with those and monitoring of those levels. So, typically, a regular multivitamin will do the trick, often layering on especially B12 for someone who's maybe on metformin medication or follows a very plant-based diet, for example. And then also if there are specific things we need to consider.
That's so interesting. So, yeah, I mean, there's so much more to it than just like, is the number appropriate? And I mean, obviously, there's anesthesia cutoffs and there's, sort of different clinics. Every clinic is a little different in terms of when they will say, okay, this, meets our criteria. We have a certain recommendation that people meet with a high risk OB doctor, over a certain
Mhm.
BMI, which is, I think, is helpful just and I actually think everyone, speaking of like everyone should have an obesity specialist working with them, everyone should have a high risk OB doctor just at one conversation to be like, okay, what is this thing called pregnancy and what's my individual risk and what can I do to mitigate those risks, right? But it's so fascinating to think about like the big picture. Um, is there anything nutritionally? Because I think that's also like to the person who wrote in, like to her point, like I've heard you talk about this before, like really focusing on like protein and just bridging nutritionally to a treatment, a fertility treatment. What do you
Mhm.
recommend and how specific can you be in terms of certain numbers and goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the considerations that I have in the GLP journey is making sure that patients are, knowing that we're going to be stopping, I will take a titration really slowly, and that plays into what we're doing from a nutritional standpoint. So when we look at any of these medications, there's a pretty broad range of doses available, and particularly for someone who, well, anybody's going to start at a low dose, but when we think, hey, there's going to be a pause or there's going to be a complete, stop for a year or 2 years, depending on what your timeline and, um, what that looks like. If we can start someone low and then go slow with their titration, that often allows us to have an amount of medication that's supporting them while then also really playing up the nutritional pieces that they can then carry forward. So we hear a lot of this conversation in the like jumpstart your weight loss journey, sort of broadly, not even related to the pre-IVF journey, but related to how do we use these medications as a tool alongside all of the other nutritional pieces. And while there's some problems in that, and I could talk about it for hours, I do think the piece of how do we use this as a tool combined with then emphasizing protein, emphasizing fiber in our diet, really learning what are the foods that naturally create satiety for us. When we think about the way our body experiences fullness, what the GLP receptor agonist medications are doing, I mean, certainly they affect us in a lot of ways, but one of the primary ways is an appetite regulation and this increased satiety signal. So we feel full more easily, we feel less hungry, and we can look at certain foods to help mimic and create that as well. So, for one, protein can be really helpful for that. It's also really important in the weight loss journey that we're thinking about protein in order to support our muscle mass. So we know that as we're losing weight, we don't want to just lose weight. We want to preferentially lose fat mass from our body. And when I say that, everybody agrees with me. And there are also things we need to do specifically to really ensure that that will be the case. So we want to make sure that we're emphasizing protein in the diet. We also want to make sure we're doing things like emphasizing resistance training, which can be supportive of that as well. From a protein standpoint, the recommendations are really broad. I think our society right now is really protein focused. So I hear a lot of people who are actually even overdoing their protein. And
Interesting.
it's hard to overdo. I mean, your body will just process it as energy. But occasionally I talk to people who are having like, 150 or 200 grams of protein per day. And the reality is you do not need quite that much protein. So at a minimum, you want to look at zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So, really entering in some simple numbers. If you are 220 pounds, that is 100 in kilograms. And so we're looking at a minimum of 80 grams of protein per day. And that's for someone who's fairly sedentary. If you are more active, you want to drive those numbers up. And so people who are more active may aim for 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. So that person who lives in a 220-pound body, that 100 kilograms, we're then looking about 100 grams per day if we're talking about that higher end of recommendation. So for most people, falling in this range of, I'll say, sort of 100 plus or minus is a really good target. Our body doesn't have great mechanisms to store protein, or actually, really any mechanisms to store protein for long periods of time. So, we do want it distributed throughout the day. So, particularly on the weight loss journey, if we're aiming for protein 3 separate times per day, that can be really helpful in fueling our body, driving satiety, but then also supporting our muscle mass during the weight loss journey. So, what I will often say is 20 to 30 grams 3 times per day is a really nice goal that can be consumed in the form of whole food. That can also be a lot of protein shakes are 20 to 30 grams. So that can be a really nice option for someone who's maybe not particularly hungry early in the day, looking for grab and go options. That can be a great thing. So the protein piece, super, super important. I think one of the other pieces that has been a little bit less talked about is fiber. And so
Mm,
fiber plays such an important role in terms of our digestion, our gut microbiome, as well as then the way our body experiences satiety and fullness. So fiber tends to be very high volume. When we think of foods that have fiber in them, we're thinking about vegetables, we're thinking about fruits, we're thinking about grains in their whole form. And when we eat foods like that, it helps to provide a lot of volume, as well as those are often have a little bit of protein in them as well, particularly when we're talking about whole grains. So when we combine these protein piece and this fiber piece, those two pieces are really the most important building blocks. Then we can look at making sure someone's adequately hydrated, making sure they're hitting their micronutrients, even if that's just a multivitamin. And those are the pieces then that can really help to bridge, even when we're looking at the cravings that come up during pregnancy.
that's so like I'm learning so much from you right now. This is so amazing. Thank you so much. I'm like, oh gosh, like, how am I doing? Right. I'm like doing my own assessment, which is like super
Mhm.
cool. I guess I have a question of like your recommendations. Did they hold like whether people are on a GLP-1 and losing weight, or if somebody is trying to maintain their weight? Like, are those the same recommendations, or are there different recommendations for like a weight loss phase versus a sort of more maintenance phase?
Yeah. So the recommendations I just gave would be honestly pretty inclusive for most humans. Someone who is living in, someone who's like a power lifter or trying to hit huge protein goals in that way, children's nutrition is going to be different. But for most adults, the recommendations that I gave are those are pretty solid. And so those will be good,
Interesting.
whether we're talking about weight loss, whether we're talking about weight maintenance. The piece in weight loss that can be really challenging is that a lot of times the appetite is so significantly suppressed that it can feel challenging to get those things in. And so, really, that intentional lens of, okay, where am I getting in the protein? Paying attention to that throughout the day can be important and, more challenging to get in if you're just not having the same hunger.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I mean, I did want to ask you about sort of intuitive eating and satiety, like, and I've heard you talk about this before in other contexts. Can you share with us how, I mean, and again, understanding that my listeners are mostly female physicians who have these busy schedules. Sometimes they're surgeons. A lot of my clients are surgeons. And like, how do you help people understand their bodies? Like, say you're like me and you never grew up sort of understanding hunger signals, and like when you're
Mhm.
full, when you're not full, like what portions are like. I mean, I learned this as an adult on my own because I had to survive, right? Like I was
Mhm.
recovering from an eating disorder actually. But like, how do you help people learn these cues? Tell us your framework because I think it's so useful.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's something we're often very in touch with when we're young. And then as we get older, we can often get out of touch with it for so many factors. Our parents saying, oh, you have to eat all the food on your plate. There's starving children elsewhere in the world, or eat your dinner if you want to get dessert. We then talk about the transition into medical school, and particularly through residency or fellowship, there's often these very demanding schedules that you don't just get to eat exactly when you're hungry, right? You may have to
Oh,
eat at times that this is the break in between surgeries. And so this is when I'm eating, or I'm not going to have an opportunity for another period of time. And so you
mhm.
think it'll be really individualized, but learning what are the pieces that fuel my body. So we think of food as fuel. And so when we think about what are the building blocks of that, looking at sort of day to day, what are the needs that I have in my life? What is my schedule going to look like? What are the foods? You do not have to spend a lot of time preparing food. It does not have to be anything complex, but what are the foods, even if it means grab and go, that are going to align with going to help me feel full, align with my health goals, and support me in that way? When we
Mhm.
think about intuitive eating, it's such a beautiful thing and can be really challenging to do when we're looking at a lot of very processed foods. So, when I say processed foods, not all foods that come in a package, while those would technically fall into the processed food label, not all of them are bad for us, but a lot of foods are going to be really high in sugar, really high in flour, things that sort of bypass our natural satiety pathways because they don't have much protein, they don't have much fiber, maybe don't even have much fat in them. And the things that drive satiety or that feeling of fullness for us are fat and protein primarily, and then fiber as well that slows down the absorption of everything. And so when we can think about what are the foods that will help signal that to me, it could be something as simple of, am I going to have a piece of whole fruit and pair that with nuts or a nut butter or a slice of cheese or a cheese stick? Is it going to be something that has some fats and proteins, so I'm going to feel satiated for long periods of time? A lot of times for people who are in busy schedules, having lots of good proteins, having some fats, that can really help them to feel pretty stable energy levels. Versus if you've ever had a day where you've eaten primarily simple carbohydrates, you feel this like roller coaster of energy throughout the day. And so, even paying attention to, okay, on the morning I had a blueberry muffin. 2 hours later, I was just ravenous, so hungry, kind of like wanted to throw up, maybe felt a little headachy, hangry, like wanted to punch someone in the face, like feeling these wild shifts in blood sugar versus the day that I had a bowl of steel cut oatmeal and there was some protein powder and some nuts and seeds and berries. I felt satiated for hours thereafter. And then, okay, what was that that drove it? And a lot of times it is the protein, it is the fat, it is the fiber that are driving those factors. So when we think about for someone who has a busy schedule, how do we plug that in? How do we plug in? Is it running out the door? My favorite grab and go snack is like those little avocado packets and like a cheese stick. And I literally use the mozzarella cheese stick as a utensil to eat avocado, which
That's
is
beautiful.
just, I mean, you probably don't want to do that while driving, but it's like a pretty quick, you could do that in a lot of settings, for example, of I'm getting some fat, I'm getting some fiber, I'm getting some protein. And if I know I need something that's going to stick with me for a couple of hours, something like that may be a good grab and go option, for example. So starting to look at what are the things that are available to us, what is our schedule, and then how do we start to honor what our body is actually asking for? And it can take some practice. It's often really helpful to do this with the support of a physician or with a coach who understands these things. But plugging and playing based on my schedule, based on my preferences, based on my goals, we're often able to align then of when my body is like actually feeling satiated and how we appropriately match our hunger.
That's so beautiful. And as I recall, like I'm on your email list. You give people this information on your email list, correct? Like I've gotten recipes
Mhm.
from you and like those sorts of things. So if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, I want to know more, please do get on Dr. Stombaugh's email list because there's this information that comes. And don't you also have a GLP guide now that I'm thinking of your resources? And we'll at the end of this
Mhm.
conversation, we'll say where can people find you. But I just wanted to mention that too
Yeah.
because I heard you talk about sort of this GLP guide that people can access that I think might help a lot of my patients who and my clients actually who really want this more detailed information to
Mhm.
kind of assist with their journeys.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, when we look at the prescribing of GLPs, it's become so common, which I think is wonderful. I feel really glad that primary care physicians and OB-GYNs and cardiologists and sleep medicine physicians, and we see these prescriptions coming out from a lot of physicians, which is amazing. And there are people who are going to need a little bit more support in their journey than what they're getting in that context. And so I created the GLP guide as an online series of videos to address a lot of the frequently asked questions that come up so that people can reference, a 5 or 10 minute video, get those quick answers. A lot of the things that we're talking about today, but it's an ever evolving resource. One of my biggest calls to action there is that, hey, if you finish or you're looking through and you're like, oh, shoot, I do not see the answer to the question I have, that you can email us and we will have that video up within 48 hours to make sure that your
Wow.
questions are getting addressed.
That's fantastic. Yeah, as I was listening to what's on that series, I was just like, wow, this is just amazing. So
Thanks.
I think you're doing a lot of like really necessary. Yes, it's outside the box thinking, and it also feels like it's like sort of plugging the gaps and the holes in so much of the like all of a sudden it happens so fast. It feels like GLP-1s for everybody, and now it's like, wait, like
Hmm.
hold up, slow up. We need a little more support. We need a little bit more attention to detail. So thank you for that. Um,
Hmm.
so I think what you said about like this sort of goes along with the intuitive eating satiety conversation is mindset. And a lot of what I do in my fertility coaching relates to mindset because it's so important. You're also a certified coach, right? We went to the same place, all the things. I wanted to
Hmm.
mention that because I don't think I clearly called that out in your bio. But can you speak a little bit about how you help your patients and your clients like with this mindset piece? Because like you said, like you stop the GLP, you see the scale go up. Even like the
Hmm.
fertility treatment in general, most people as they're undergoing IVF steadily gain weight because it's like, oh shoot, don't exercise now, and people are kind of off their rhythm. So yeah, please, if you could
Hmm.
speak to the mindset piece about the weight journey, that would be so helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where the magic is, because when we look at, particularly your listeners, we're talking about very intelligent women who are physicians, right? Most of my patients, even whether they're physicians or not, they could write a book on nutrition. They've been through dozens of diet plans in the past. They know a lot about nutrition, and it's not about the knowing, it's about like, where does the rubber meet the road? Like, when in my day to day life, what are the challenges that get in the way? Where am I eating for reasons like my schedule? Where am I eating where I'm not hungry? Paying attention to, are there times where emotional eating is coming up, for example? And emotional eating being eating for any reason that's not physical hunger. And so that can be sometimes very clearly in response to a stressful situation, or sometimes it's even a situation like boredom, for example, of recognizing like, oh, what's in the pantry right now? There's a lot of pieces that come up with cravings. And so recognizing that cravings are often very physiologically driven as well as psychologically driven. And so approaching cravings can take this two-prong approach where we're thinking about sometimes medications, whether that's GLPs or others, as well as thinking about what are my patterns surrounding that, for example. So starting to break down, even if I know what to do, what are the barriers that are getting in my way of implementing that? And then how do I start to see where those challenges are and work through them one by one? And the fun thing about that skill set is it follows you for the rest of your life. And so, I think about my patients and I'm like, okay, we're talking about 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we're building a toolbox that you just get to have then forever. And so that can look like someone, for example, who's eating in the evening times and they have maybe finished charting for the evening. They finally have this opportunity. They've had dinner, they've wound down, they've maybe charted, and it's like, okay, I've got this free time available to me. That is a very common time where people may like, oh, I'll just go have a snack, for example. So if that's happening, starting to recognize, okay, is there a piece coming up where maybe I'm feeling bad for myself or feeling like, oh, I deserve a reward after doing those charts, for example. Now I deserve to feel something good. And you do, right? Like if you've been charting, like you deserve to take care of yourself as a human. You deserve to have goodness and wonderful things in your life. And is eating at that time the best way to meet that? Maybe, but a lot of times typically not. There's other things that we can do that will help you feel good, help you to feel relaxation that are going to be in line with your health goals. Sometimes we're looking at pattern interrupt. So can it be something like, okay, as soon as I finish eating dinner, for example, I go and brush my teeth. I don't know about you, but as soon as I brush my teeth for the evening, I'm like, I'm good. My husband the other night was like, hey, let's have some ice cream. I was like, "Ugh, I already brushed my teeth. I'm like, I probably would have had ice cream. And I'm like, I don't want to do that again. And so are these things that they're silly, right? At sometimes, but they can add up in these really significant ways. We start to work through our challenges and then build in tools that help us support to align with our goals.
Oh, that is like amazing. I just want to bottle that up. And, I think in our coaching school, I don't know if you remember that worksheet that was like the 100 allowed urges.
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I admittedly have a sugar addiction and like I find that like when I don't have sugar, I don't want it. And then as soon as I kind of like fall off the wagon, I'm like, oh, it's 8 p.m. I like want XYZ. And like it's so amazing. But you're right, it's
Mhm.
physiological as well. And so and I did this when I was like trying to, stop afternoon coffee and those sorts of things. Like I think, it does not kill us to allow the urge to happen. And it's almost like
Mhm.
it like kind of comes to a peak, it's uncomfortable, but then it sort of dissipates. And coaching is all about sort of leaning into the discomfort in the service of growth. And so I think, as we are really honest with ourselves and saying, okay, like what patterns are serving me, what patterns are not serving me, and maybe we need to add a little bit more into our dinners or our lunches or something. Like maybe we truly are hungry, but like we know
Right.
that like, sort of eating at those hours and trying to wind down, maybe we're trying to it's counterproductive at that point. So I think that's brilliant to just like look at the patterns in a non-judgmental way and say like what are some other ways? So what are some other ways that we could reward ourselves at like say 9, 10 p.m. we finish charting, we really want to feel good that don't involve going to the pantry.
Yeah. So I will often give my patients this exact assignment to answer the question because I'm always so amazed by the things that people come up with because we all have our own interests and preferences. And so I will even encourage your listeners if you are someone who struggles, whether it's mid afternoon, whether it's evening, if there is a time where you have this coming up of you're like I want to feel good right now. The food is away and it does. Like food gives us a dopamine hit, particularly the processed foods. They give us this hit that can feel really intensely pleasurable for a period of time. It just doesn't have a lasting pleasure. And a lot of times, especially if we're in a weight loss journey, there's this an effect then where we're like, gosh, like, why did I do that? I didn't, that's not in line with my goals. Sometimes really beating ourselves up. So I'll encourage your listeners, if this is coming up, what are the things that bring pleasure in your life that then you can even keep on a list and reference at times where you're like, I feel bad, I want to feel good, sort of simply said, and then reference that list. But this can look like a lot of different things. This can look like being outside. So whether it's sitting on the porch, going for a slow walk, literally smelling the flowers. So, just observing nature, seeing what's around us, paying attention to the sounds, birds chirping, for example, or watching the sunset, these things that can be really, we can feel really connected to the earth and to the world. There can also be things that are self care routines. So, this can look like a really decadent skincare routine, for example. This can look like unwinding into a book, particularly really any book, but like a fiction book that you just, love and is going to be a little bit of page turner, don't read your page turner the minute before you're trying to fall asleep. But if you want to spend some time with a magazine, for example, and looking at home decor or, whatever your interests are, for example, and starting to pay attention to, is there like, do I need my hands to be busy? Like maybe I'm knitting or crocheting, for example. Do I want to be drinking something? Do I want to be like holding a warm cup of tea, for example, feeling that warmth, getting the flavors, having the experience of still consuming something, but more in line with my health goals. Maybe that's even helping you with sleep if you're having a chamomile tea or something like that. So this can look like a lot of different things. That's such a small snapshot, but I'm so impressed with my patients all the time will come up with things like, oh, one of my patients started throwing pottery, for example. I have a patient who
Wow.
does like adult coloring books and all of these things that whatever your interests are, things that give you that little bit of almost even childish pleasure, dancing to a song. I have a patient who'll put on a favorite song and dance to it. What are those things that bring up some joy for you? And it can be sometimes an intense sort of bubbling up joy. It can also be a more subtle thing depending on maybe the time of day and what you need.
That is so fascinating. And I mean, I would encourage anyone who's listening, and I promise you, I'm going to do this exercise as well, even though I've done it in other versions, but I'm going to do it specifically for this purpose, because as we evolve, we always come up with new things. Um, do this exercise, my friends. Do it, see what comes up. And this is in line with what I always tell, my clients, is that sometimes as physicians, we don't think we deserve this, right? We're like, I am fighting the good fight. I am charting at night if that's something that you do. Like I am a warrior and we forget that we're human beings with physical needs and
Hmm.
the mindfulness piece, like getting into our bodies, connecting with nature, even asking ourselves the question like what would I enjoy? What would feel decadent? What would feel delicious, luxurious, all those things like probably does, sort of ask that we slow down a little bit, but I think that's good for our nervous systems too, but it's counter to that. We have to be productive at every single moment. And I think that's part of why we are in this very intense, like, you know, work hard, play hard. And if play hard is go to the pantry, that is what it is. You know what I mean? So I think
Hmm.
if we can soften a little bit and just recognize that we're worthy of connection, we're worthy of joy, we're worthy of having these pleasurable things in our routine, whether it's like first thing in the morning or at night as we're winding down. I think we talk about the morning routine. Everyone's like, "Oh, you need a morning routine because that's what productive people do," but we don't talk enough about like a wind down routine either. So
Hmm.
I really I want us all to embrace this idea because I think it's going to help us with this emotional eating, weight management, weight loss, whatever journey we're on. But I also think it's going to help us become just happier human beings, which isn't that the point? So
Hmm.
wow, blown my mind, Dr. Stombaugh, as always. So, is there anything else you want our listeners to hear? And I obviously want people to know where to find you. But is there anything else that's on your mind where you're like, I just really need for people to know this thing?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked because one of the things, even coming back to the very beginning in the case study, the person who reached out to you with a question of coming off of Wegovy, is there a good bridge? The Saxenda or liraglutide, that daily GLP, is a great option. What's also a great option, either in addition or separately from this, are medications like metformin and bupropion. And these are medications that are very frequently given during pregnancy. Metformin is a medications for the treatment or medication for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. So sometimes this medication is continued during pregnancy for patients who've been using it otherwise. Bupropion is a medication typically thought of for the treatment of mood, originally FDA approved for the treatment of depression, but does help with some of that craving urge pathway, for example, and is sometimes given throughout pregnancy for women who've been using it from a mood standpoint. A lot of times we may continue mood medications during pregnancy. And so I say that to say the metformin medication works on some of the underlying insulin resistant pathways in our body. The bupropion medication works on some of that craving and urge pathway. They're very different from one another, so they can even be given together. Um, or sort of, alongside one another. And those are medications that someone may decide, yes or no, I want to continue this during pregnancy. But we have really good safety data about that. And so there's no, okay, I have to stop for egg retrieval, I have to stop for implantation, I have to stop for any point. You may, of course, have this conversation with your REI, with your maternal fetal medicine physician, talking about the risk and benefits of those medications. But when we look at the effect of the GLPs, they work on the insulin resistance, they work on the cravings. Are there other things that may be safe options that can be a good bridge? And so I wanted to mention these as things to consider as well, because they're often something I'm starting alongside even the GLP medications or using to bridge as well, and could be something even continued through the duration of the IVF and pregnancy journey.
That is so wonderful. I think that's going to help so many people because it is that sort of jagged, not smooth path to getting to where we're
Mhm.
trying to go. And I think that if we can smooth out that piece of things physiologically, I think that's going to help so many people. And thank you very much. You're so creative and you're so knowledgeable. And this information is really going to help so many people. So thank you for sharing that extra pearl. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard all the value that I just heard. I'm gonna re-listen to this episode again to make sure I can get all the juice, right? To help my people and myself really, because this is also I'm learning so much too that's gonna help me personally. Dr. Samba, where can people find you?
Yes, absolutely. So I have a podcast called Conquer Your Weight, as you mentioned. That is a great resource. Even some recommendations looking at the mindset piece. This so commonly, as we talked about, is really important. And so one of my favorite episodes I recorded was just last week called Progress, Not Perfection. I feel like this comes up so often. So definitely check out the podcast as a great resource. I have episodes every week. I also have some online resources. I try to be everywhere on social media. And so find me across Instagram or TikTok or Facebook. I have a lot of content that I put out there, and engage with me if you have questions. I'd love to answer those for any of your listeners. I also do, as you mentioned, have a program called the GLP Guide. This is a self-paced online series of videos addressing the most frequently asked questions for patients who are using GLP medications. It's a really affordable resource. It's $97 for a full year of access. And like I said, if someone's reviewing it and they're like, oh gosh, it doesn't have the answer to the question I wanted, this was the whole reason I bought it, we would just email our team and we would answer that for you right away. I would answer that for you right away, get that up within a couple of days. And so I would love to share that with anyone. But for any of your listeners, I know you'll have my contact information. Please always feel free to reach out. I'd love to connect you with even a board certified obesity physician in their area.
And remind us, so somebody might be listening to this being like, holy cow, I want her part of my treatment team. Where do you have licenses so that the people who are in those states can find you in that way?
Yeah, so I'm in person in Charlottesville, Virginia. Then I see patients throughout Virginia, Illinois, and Tennessee by telemedicine.
Beautiful. That's awesome. And maybe add on a few more because the world needs you. And thank you so much for what you do because you're helping so many people. So thank you so much for
Absolutely.
coming on today. And I can't wait to collaborate more and have more conversations, my friend.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Love and Science podcast. I'm so glad you joined us today. If you found this conversation valuable, if you could please rate, review, and share this podcast with your trusted people, it would mean so much to me. If you want more tools to help you navigate the fertility journey, please book a discovery call with me today. The link is in the show notes. Please do not let infertility have the final word. I'm here to take the burden from you so that you can achieve your goal of building your family. In gratitude, this is Dr. Erica Bove. I'm rooting for you always.